In a small brick shed behind her rented house on Bagley Avenue in Detroit, Michigan, a man was working in secret. His neighbors thought he had lost his mind. His wife, Clara, had learned not to ask too many questions. The smell of gasoline and hot metal poured out from under the shed door at all hours of the night, mixing with the cold Michigan air. Inside, hunched over a workbench that barely had room for two people, was a 32-year-old engineer named Henry Ford. He was not a rich man. He was not a famous man. He was a chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, a good, stable job, the kind of job that a sensible man would protect at all costs. Henry Ford was not a sensible man. What he was building inside that shed had no official name yet. It had no price tag, no investor, and no market. It was a primitive, rattling contraption of bicycle wheels, a buggy frame, and a small gasoline engine assembled largely from cast-off parts. He called it, with no poetry at all, the quadricycle. 4 bicycle wheels, a small engine, a tiller for steering, a leather seat borrowed from a farm buggy, no brakes, no reverse gear, no roof. If it rained, you got wet. If it stopped, you pushed. And on the morning of June 4th, 1896, when Henry Ford decided it was finally time to test his machine on the streets of Detroit, he discovered a problem that was both embarrassing and, in retrospect, deeply symbolic. The quadricycle was too wide to fit through the door of the shed he had built it in. So he picked up an axe and knocked down the wall. This was not a metaphor. This was not a cute story invented by a marketing department. This was a man who had built a dream in a room that could not contain it, and his response was not to make the dream smaller. His response was to destroy the obstacle. He drove the quadricycle out through the rubble of his own wall at 4 o'clock in the morning, rattling and coughing down the wet cobblestones of Detroit, while his friend James Bishop ran ahead of him with a lantern to warn any approaching horses. The machine ran for about 1 mile before it broke down. Ford fixed it on the side of the road, drove it home, and went to his irregular job a few hours later, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something extraordinary had happened. A wall had been knocked down. And walls, once knocked down, have a habit of staying that way. The story of Henry Ford is not the story of a man who succeeded on his first attempt, or his second. It is the story of a man who treated failure the way a blacksmith treats raw iron, as raw material to be heated, hammered, and shaped into something useful. His first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, was formed in 1899 with backing from a group of wealthy Detroit investors. It lasted 18 months. Ford could not deliver a car that satisfied him. He kept redesigning, kept rebuilding, kept insisting that it wasn't ready yet, while his investors watched their money evaporate. The company folded in 1901, and the investors walked away shaking their heads. His second company, the Henry Ford Company, was formed almost immediately after. Same result, different investors, same impatience, same insistence on perfection over profit. This time, the investors brought in a professional manager to control him, a man named Henry Leland. Ford, unwilling to be managed, walked out. The investors renamed the company after Leland. You might know it by that name today. They called it Cadillac. Ford was 38 years old. He had failed twice. He had no company, little money, and a reputation in Detroit's business community as a brilliant, impossible, unreliable dreamer. Most men at this point would have gone back to the Edison Company and asked for their job back. Henry Ford went to the racetrack. He understood something that his investors did not. In 1901, the automobile was not yet a product. It was still a spectacle. The American public needed to be convinced that these machines were real, that they were powerful, that they were worth believing in. And the fastest way to make that argument was not through a sales brochure. It was through speed. He built a racing car he called the 999, a brutal, stripped-down monster with a 4-cylinder engine so loud that the driver needed to stuff his ears with cotton just to stay conscious. He found a daredevil bicycle racer named Barney Oldfield, who had never driven a car in his life, and taught him to drive it in 1 week. On October 25, 1902, Barney Oldfield climbed into the 999 at a track outside Detroit, gripped the tiller with both hands, and drove it to a world record. 1 mile in 1 minute and 1 second. The crowd went insane. The newspapers ran the story on the front page. And suddenly, Henry Ford was not a twice-failed businessman. He was the man behind the fastest machine on earth. The investors came back. New ones, better ones. Investors who had seen what he could do when he was allowed to do it. On June 16, 1903, the Ford Motor Company was incorporated for the third and final time, with 12 investors putting in a total of $28,000. Henry Ford owned 25.5% of the company. He was not the majority owner. He was not fully in control. But for now, it was enough. He had his factory. He had his workers. He had his dream. The hungry man with the axe and the lantern was back in business. The early Ford Motor Company produced a series of cars designated by letters of the alphabet. The Model A, the Model B, the Model C, the Model N. Each one was a modest improvement over the last. Each one sold reasonably well. Each one made the investors happy enough. But Henry Ford was not interested in selling cars to the small number of wealthy Americans who could afford them. He had a larger, stranger, more ambitious idea that he could not stop thinking about, an idea that his business partners thought was dangerously idealistic. He wanted to build a car for everyone. Not for the doctor or the banker or the merchant, for the farmer, for the factory worker, for the man who woke up at 5 in the morning and went to bed at 9 at night with dirt under his fingernails and $20 in his pocket. He wanted to build a machine so simple that a man who had never seen an engine could fix it in a field with the tools he already had. He wanted to build it so cheaply that the man who built it could afford to buy it. In 1908, that car arrived. They called it the Model T. It was not beautiful. It was not fast. It was not luxurious. It was painted black, because black paint dried faster than any other color, and Ford cared about efficiency, not aesthetics. It had 4 cylinders. It weighed about 1,200 pounds. It could reach a top speed of around 40 miles per hour on a good road, and America in 1908 had very few good roads. It cost $850, which was still expensive, but it was far less than any comparable vehicle on the market. The public responded with something approaching hysteria. In its first full year of production, Ford sold 10,000 Model Ts. The year after, 18,000. Orders were piling up faster than the factory could fill them. And here is where the story of the Model T ends, and the story of the assembly line begins, because these are 2 entirely different stories about 2 entirely different ideas. The first story is about a product. The second is about a system. And the second story is the one that changed the world. Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. The concept of breaking complex work into simple, repeatable steps had been developing in American manufacturing for decades. What Ford did, and what made him a figure of genuine historical consequence, was apply this principle to the construction of a complex machine with thousands of individual parts, at a scale that no one had ever attempted. The Highland Park factory, which opened in 1910, was the laboratory for this experiment. Instead of a worker walking to the parts he needed, the parts were brought to the worker. Instead of one skilled mechanic assembling an entire engine from start to finish, each worker performed a single specific task. One man installed the left front wheel. Another tightened the bolts. Another tested the tension. Nothing more, nothing less. Every day, every shift, without variation. In 1913, they installed the moving assembly line itself, a continuous chain that pulled the car chassis slowly through the factory, while workers stood at fixed stations on either side. The time required to assemble a single Model T dropped from 12.5 hours to 93 minutes. 93 minutes. a complete automobile in the time it takes to watch a film. The price of the Model T fell every single year for the next decade. By 1925, it cost $260. Half the cars on American roads were Model Ts. Farmers who had never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace were suddenly mobile. The geography of American life began to reshape itself around the automobile, and the automobile, for most Americans, meant Ford. But on the factory floor of Highland Park, something else was happening. Something quieter and darker, and more difficult to quantify. The men on the assembly line were not building cars. They were becoming parts of the machine themselves. The work was perfectly designed to require no thought. A man did not need to understand what he was building. He needed to perform his single motion, correctly and at speed, for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, until his shift ended and he walked out into the air and tried to remember who he was. Ford had not just built a faster car. He had built a faster human. And like all machines pushed beyond their limits, the human parts were the first to break. By 1913, the Highland Park factory was hemorrhaging workers. The turnover rate had reached 370% per year. To keep 900 workers on the line at any given moment, Ford had to hire 33,000 people per year. Men were walking off the line mid-shift and never coming back. The work was so monotonous, so physically grinding, so utterly devoid of meaning, that even the relatively good wages Ford was paying were not enough to keep people coming back. On January 5, 1914, Henry Ford announced a solution that stunned the business world. He declared that Ford Motor Company would immediately begin paying its workers a minimum wage of $5 per day, more than double the industry standard. The Wall Street Journal called it an economic crime. Other manufacturers howled that Ford was going to destroy the American labor market. Economists debated whether it was philanthropy or lunacy. It was neither. It was strategy. Ford understood two things with cold precision. First, that a stable, satisfied workforce was more profitable than a constantly rotating one. The cost of training new workers, the errors made by inexperienced hands, the slowdowns caused by constant churn, these were all expenses that could be eliminated by simply paying people enough to want to stay. The $5 day was not charity. It was an investment in efficiency. But there was a second calculation, one that Ford rarely discussed publicly. He looked at the thousands of men working in his factory and saw something his competitors had missed. He saw customers. If these men were paid enough to buy the car they were building, then every worker became a potential consumer. The $5 day was, in a very real sense, Ford paying his workers to buy his own product. The announcement created scenes of near riot outside the Highland Park factory. Thousands of men lined up in the freezing January cold, some having traveled hundreds of miles on the rumor of $5 wages. The line stretched for miles. Police were called. Fire hoses were turned on the crowd in below freezing temperatures. The newspapers published photographs of desperate men clawing at the factory gates, and the captions called Henry Ford a hero of the working class. But if you read the fine print of the $5 offer, something more complicated emerged. The $5 per day was not a wage. It was a wage plus a profit-sharing bonus, and the bonus was conditional. To qualify, a worker had to demonstrate that he was living, in the judgment of Ford Motor Company, a clean and wholesome life. To enforce this standard, Ford created what he called the Sociological Department, a team of investigators whose job was to visit the homes of Ford workers and assess the quality of their private lives. They knocked on doors unannounced. They interviewed wives. They inspected kitchens and bedrooms. They asked about drinking habits, church attendance, and savings accounts. If the worker did not meet the standard of American values that Henry Ford had decided were correct, the bonus was withheld. For the thousands of immigrant workers in the factory, men who had come from Poland, Italy, Hungary, and Russia, the Sociological Department was not a benefit program, it was surveillance. It was the company inserting itself into the most private corners of their existence and rendering judgment on whether their culture, their habits, their very identities were acceptable. Ford gave his workers enough money to buy the car they were building. Then he made sure they had no time, no energy, and no private life left to enjoy anything else. The factory floor was humming. But underneath that hum was the sound of something else entirely. The sound of men being turned into instruments. Precise, efficient, replaceable. By the early 1920s, Henry Ford had become something that no American industrialist had ever quite become before. He was not just rich. He was not just powerful. He was a philosopher king. A man whose opinions on every subject from diet to democracy were printed in newspapers and read by millions. There was a serious movement, backed by significant money and political support, to draft Henry Ford as a candidate for the presidency of the United States. Polls showed him leading the field. And Henry Ford, at the absolute peak of his influence, chose to use it in the most destructive way imaginable. In 1918, Ford purchased a small local newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. He turned it into a national publication distributed through every Ford dealership in America, making it almost overnight one of the most widely read papers in the country. And for nearly 91 consecutive weeks beginning in May of 1920, the Dearborn Independent published a series of articles that constituted the most sustained anti-Semitic propaganda campaign in American history up to that point. The articles accused Jewish people of controlling international finance, corrupting American culture, orchestrating the First World War, and manipulating the government. They were vicious, detailed, and presented with the full authority of a man who had personally put America on wheels. In Munich, Germany, a struggling political agitator named Adolf Hitler read them carefully. He kept a portrait of Henry Ford on the wall of his office. In 1931, an American reporter who interviewed Hitler noted the portrait and asked about it. Hitler said he regarded Ford as his inspiration. In 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, the Nazi government awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Third Reich could give to a foreign civilian. Henry Ford accepted the medal. Ford eventually issued a retraction of the anti-Semitic articles in 1927, under legal pressure and threats of boycott. Most historians believe the retraction was insincere, a business calculation rather than a moral reckoning. The damage in America and in Europe had already been done. The most respected industrialist in the world had lent his name and his platform to a hatred that would within 2 decades produce industrial-scale murder. This is not a footnote in the history of Ford Motor Company. This is a central chapter. You cannot understand Henry Ford without it. And in those same years, Ford was also building the River Rouge complex, the largest integrated manufacturing facility in the world. It sat on 2,000 acres along the River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan. It had its own railroad, its own power plant, its own steel mill, its own glass plant, its own rubber plant. Iron ore and coal arrived on Ford-owned freighters and came out the other end as finished automobiles within 28 hours. It was, depending on your perspective, either the greatest achievement of American industrial capitalism or the most perfect physical embodiment of a man-doism, absolute total control. On March 7, 1932, in the depths of the Great Depression, approximately 3,000 unemployed men marched from downtown Detroit toward the River Rouge plant. They called it the Ford Hunger March. Many of them had worked at Ford, had built the Model T and the Model A with their hands, had spent years of their lives inside the Rouge. Now they had nothing. The Depression had swallowed their savings, their jobs, their futures. They were marching to present a simple list of demands: rehire laid-off workers, stop using child labor, abolish the Sociological Department, pay workers medical expenses. They were met at the Dearborn City line by police and by agents of Henry Ford's security apparatus, a department run by a former boxer and Navy man named Harry Bennett. Bennett was Ford's enforcer, his personal instrument of control, a man who recruited ex-convicts and former gangsters to patrol the factory floor and keep the workers in line. The great irony of Henry Ford's genius is that the same quality that created his empire ultimately began to destroy it. The obsessive, uncompromising certainty that had knocked down walls and broken records became, in the 1920s and 1930s, a profound blindness. The Model T had been a revolution. But it had also been a product, and products, no matter how revolutionary, eventually age. By the mid-1920s, American Roa, when the marchers reached the Rouge, they were first hit with fire hoses in below freezing temperatures. When they kept marching, the police and Ford security men opened fire with live ammunition. 4 men were killed. Dozens more were wounded. Henry Ford did not appear publicly. Ford management called the marchers communist agitators. The Detroit press, much of which depended on Ford advertising revenue, largely supported this characterization. The men who were killed were buried in a cemetery in Detroit. Thousands of people attended the funeral. This was the machine behind the machine. The assembly line ran. The cars came out. The profit accumulated. And if men stood in the road and asked for too much, Harry Bennett's men had answers for them. The great liberator of the American farmer, the man who had put the continent in motion, had shot the people who were asking him for work. The assembly line kept its rhythm. The blood washed away in the rain. Their tastes were changing. They wanted cars that were more comfortable, cars that came in colors other than black, cars with more power and more personality. General Motors, led by a precise and methodical businessman named Alfred Sloan, had figured something out that Ford refused to consider. Different customers wanted different things. Sloan organized GM into separate divisions, each targeting a different income level. Chevrolet for the working family, Pontiac for those who wanted a little more, Buick for the professional class, Cadillac for the wealthy. He called it a car for every purse and purpose. It was a strategy of choice in an era of rising expectations. Ford's response to this strategy was the single most famous dismissal in the history of American business. Any customer can have a car painted any color he wants, so long as it is black. By 1926, GM had overtaken Ford in sales for the first time. Ford finally acknowledged that the Model T was dying. In May of 1927, he shut down the entire Ford Motor Company for 6 months. Every factory, every assembly line, gone quiet. 100,000 workers were laid off without warning, without severance, without any plan for when or whether the work would return. They had built his empire with their hands. He turned them out into the street like a change of season. The new Model A arrived in 1927 and was a genuine success. It sold well. It came in colors. For a moment, it seemed as if Ford had managed to reinvent himself. But the reinvention was superficial. Ford Motor Company was still a company structured entirely around the vision and will of a single man who was now in his mid-60s and growing increasingly erratic, suspicious, and rigid. The engineers were afraid of him. The executives walked on glass. No one could tell him his instincts were wrong, because no one who had told him that in the past had kept their job. The company that had been built on the courage of one man was now paralyzed by his ego. There was one person inside Ford Motor Company who might have softened Henry Ford's edges. One person who understood both the world that was changing outside the company and the machinery of power that operated within it. One person who combined genuine aesthetic talent with an instinctive feel for what American consumers actually wanted. His name was Edsel Ford, Henry's only son. Edsel had grown up inside the company. He had been made president of Ford Motor Company in 1919, a title that carried enormous formal authority and almost no real power. Henry Ford retained control of every significant decision. Edsel could propose, suggest, advocate, and design. Henry could approve or destroy with a single word, and Henry's word was always final. Edsel was, by nearly every account of those who knew him, a good man. He had an eye for design that his father entirely lacked. He was the driving force behind the Lincoln Continental, a car still considered one of the most beautiful American automobiles ever built. he commissioned Diego Rivera's Detroit murals. He wanted Ford to make cars that people didn't just need, but loved. Henry Ford responded to his son's talent and judgment by humiliating him, regularly, deliberately, in front of other executives, in front of engineers, in front of workers. If Edsel made a decision, Henry would reverse it without explanation. Harry Bennett was given tacit permission to undermine Edsel's authority within the company at every opportunity. The humiliation was not casual, it was systematic. Historians who have studied this period carefully have concluded that Henry Ford seemed to be deliberately trying to break his own son, whether out of jealousy, control. In January of 1942, Edsel Ford became seriously ill. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He was 49 years old. He died in May of 1943. Henry Ford built machines that connected millions of strangers across thousands of miles. He could not find a way to connect with his own son across a conference table. The man who knocked down walls to bring his dream into the world had built, inside his own family, a wall that neither of them could ever break through. Edsel's vision did not die with him, but the man who most deserved to see it realized never did. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947. He was 83 years old. He died at Fair Lane, his estate on the River Rouge, during a spring storm that had knocked out the power and flooded the generators. The lights in the mansion went out and candles were brought. The man who had done more than any other single individual to create the electrical, mechanical, petroleum-powered modern world died by candlelight, who had put power in the hands of millions, spent his last hours in the same darkness as the farmers he had set out to liberate. Ford Motor Company survived him. Henry Ford, too, took control in 1945 and reformed the company with a competence and thoroughness that the old man would probably have both admired and resented. The post-war boom made Ford rich again. The Mustang, launched in 1964, became one of the greatest product launches in automotive history. Not the best-selling truck, the best-selling vehicle. Cars, trucks, everything. Ford survived the oil crisis of the 1970s. It survived the Japanese import wave that battered Detroit in the 1980s. It survived the financial crisis of 2008 without taking a government bailout, a decision that preserved a certain pride even as the company bled. But now, in the third decade of the 21st century, Ford Motor Company is standing at the edge of something that feels different from every crisis that came before. The electric revolution is not a crisis of quality or market share or labor costs. It is a crisis of identity. The roar of the engine, the smell of the fuel, the physical sensation of mechanical power that 100 years of Ford marketing had taught Americans to associate with freedom itself is being replaced by silence. Ford has committed $50 billion to the transition to electric vehicles. The F-150 Lightning has arrived. It is, by most technical measures, an impressive machine. But it costs more than many of its buyers can afford. And it does not sound like anything. It does not smell like anything. The young buyers Ford needs are looking at Tesla and wondering why they should choose the legacy brand with the complicated history. Ford is caught in the same trap that has swallowed empires before it. It is trying to honor the past while building the future, and the past and the future are pulling in opposite directions with the full weight of 120 years of history between them. In that brick shed on Bagley Avenue in 1896, a man knocked down a wall because his dream had outgrown the room he had built it in. The dream got out. It covered the earth. It connected continents. It reshaped the geography and the culture and the economy of the most powerful nation in the history of the world. And now the question is whether the company that carries his name can do what he did. Whether it can look at the wall in front of it, pick up the axe, and knock it down. Whether it can drive out into the dark on a machine no one has seen before, with someone running ahead to light the way. Henry Ford was 32 years old when he drove the quadricycle out through the rubble of his own wall at 4 in the morning. He was not afraid of the dark. He was not afraid of the unknown. He was not afraid of the silence before the engine caught and the world heard. For the first time, the sound of what was coming.